Good evening, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for having me tonight at Sherith, Israel, and allowing me to be part of your Shabbat service and our Pride Shabbat. It's just a really an incredible honor, so thank you so much. Um, as a gay Jewish man, it's just always moving for me to see the ability to hold space for multiple communities and for those of us who have that intersectionality, who may not always feel fully a part of any one community, but we are a community when we come together, because there are many of us. And that dual identity has, for me, played a key role in my life for many, many years, back to when I was a child, when I was a closeted gay boy in a very, very non-Jewish part of New Jersey, where we moved in 1973, and my parents asked, or our neighbors asked my parents why we didn't have horns. That's the kind of community I grew up in. So I had the sort of challenges around both of my identities growing up, but those identities ultimately, for me, have been so powerful together. And I will say that we have different kinds of spiritual leaders sometimes in our communities, and I'll say, when we look at, say, rabbis and drag queens, they are very different in many ways, but they also give a lot of support to communities that are going through hard times. And even though drag queens certainly often have better attire and do much better makeup, they both play an incredible role, including during the hardest of times, as we are seeing now, for example, when drag queens are being criminalized and harassed and attacked and demonized around the country, but are rising strong to represent our community. And frankly, rabbis are playing that role also often in the last 8 months, as our community, as the Jewish community, has been under assault. So I mentioned where I grew up, and I grew up in a place, we moved there, our neighbors wondered why we didn't have horns, and there was no synagogue, there was no congregation, and my parents were one of a group of about 15 Jewish families that came together in the early 1970s and founded a synagogue. It was a conservative congregation. We could not find a conservative rabbi, so we imported an Orthodox rabbi who lived about an hour away, and he would drive down before sunset on Friday and stay at our home for Shabbat, and we would walk to synagogue together. And that synagogue was my life growing up. I did not have any friends outside of the synagogue before 10th grade. Everything circled around that synagogue. And during much of my childhood, I knew that I was different. And we know that in the Jewish community, although the Jewish community certainly, compared to other communities, has very much more welcoming views towards LGBTQ people, there are still challenges. And so it was at times scary for me. I did not know, although I knew my parents would be welcoming, I didn't know how the community as a whole would react. And that, for any queer child, is always really, really scary, which is why when we talk about some of these forced outing policies that we're seeing around the state and around the country, requiring teachers to call the parent as soon as a child maybe changes their pronouns or dresses a different way, it's very real for that child, for any of us. We all know how that feels. It's important for all of us to be able to do that when we want to do it, when we're ready to tell people. And for me, I was lucky that I ultimately had an incredibly good experience coming out as a Jew. The first person I told was my younger sister, who was amazing as always. She's an HIV doctor now, so it ended up playing out exactly as it should. But I was in college, and I was a member of a Jewish fraternity, Alpha Epsilon Pi, in Duke University in the late 1980s. early 1990s, during the height of the HIV disaster and the height of absolute hatred and fear of our community, especially of gay men, because they all assumed that we all had HIV and that if you got anywhere near us, you were going to get it too. It was for anyone who was around during that time period where there was so much fear and ignorance around HIV and AIDS. It was scary, and it was a scary time to be a young gay man. And so it was 1990, I was beginning to come out, and I wanted to be president of my fraternity. That was something I wanted to do. And I thought to myself, should I tell my fraternity brothers that I'm gay? And I said to myself, well, if I do, I'm not going to be president, so I have to make a choice. Am I going to come out and tell them who I am, or am I going to be able to be president of the fraternity? Ultimately, for anyone who's come out, you know that once you start telling people, it becomes like this avalanche. You want to like tell more and more people. It just becomes like something you want to do, which is amazing. And so I couldn't stop. So I decided to tell them, and I told them together in a meeting one night. And I said, okay, well, there it is. I'm not going to be president. And 2 months later, they elected me unanimously as president of the fraternity. And so that, to me, was really the first time that I experienced truly that intersectionality of what it means to be a gay man in the Jewish community. And then subsequently, I would learn what it means to be a Jew within the LGBTQ community, which has its ups and its downs, just like the reverse does. And, you know, I will say that being Jewish in queer spaces, it's often great. There are so many of us, and there are so many LGBTQ people who so deeply get it. And we have an amazing lineage of LGBTQ Jewish elected officials, especially here in San Francisco, going back to Harvey Milk, the granddaddy of them all, who was a Zionist, by the way, lefty, progressive Harvey Milk, who believed Jews should have a homeland, to Carol Migden and Mark Leno and Bevan Dufty, Raphael Mandelman. I could go on, Leslie Katz, lots of gay men and lesbians. We'll have some trans folk, trans Jews elected here at some point, I hope soon. And that's been really powerful. But there is another side of it. And there are times when it is not easy to be Jewish in queer spaces, and there are times when you are almost expected to give up your Jewishness to be in a queer space, because in some circles, being Jewish means really you're not pure. You can't actually be progressive, or you can be if you refute part of your Jewishness by proclaiming that Jews should not have a homeland. And that's what we've seen play out for many years in some aspects of the LGBTQ community. And it has been even more so in the last 8 months. And we have seen over and over again these scenes play out. And it's happened to me we're in a gay bar where someone will come up and say, you shouldn't be here. How dare you be here because you believe that Jews should have a homeland. They don't use those words, they use other ways of saying it because they don't want to actually admit what they're saying, but that's what they're saying. And I can take that. I'm an elected official. I have thick skin. You have to have thick skin. People say things about me all the time, and that's okay. That's democracy. But I also know other gay Jews who did not sign up to be an elected official, who did not sign up for people to do that, who have been treated like that in queer spaces because they believe that Jews should have a homeland. It has been hard. It's been hard for all of us in the last 8 months. It was hard when Hamas was literally physically in southern Israel massacring people, and before they had even been ejected, well, people were out celebrating in the streets while the massacre was still happening. That was painful, and it's painful to continue to have folks in not just in the LGBTQ community, but I hold my community to a higher standard, to so just casually call for the destruction of the home of half of all Jews on the planet. That is hard, because when you are a queer person, we know what it's like to be cast out, not to have a place where you feel safe, and everyone should have a place where they feel safe. And for those of us in the Jewish community and LGBTQ Jews, for those of us who are critics of the current government of Israel, who love that Israel is in many ways so welcoming to queer people, but on the other hand has a coalition government with some members who make certain Republican US senators look tame. For those of us who hate the West Bank settlement policy, for those of us who are just depressed about the level of just destruction happening in Gaza, it becomes complex. But on the other hand, it's not complex. We want peace, and we want there to be a place for Jews, and we want there to be a place where Palestinians have self-determination, and we want there to be a place everywhere where if you are a Palestinian queer person, if you are Jewish queer person, Israeli queer person, that you are able to be who you are and live your life and not have violence inflicted on you. That's what we all want in the end. That's what Pride Shabbat is about. It's taking two amazing communities, a community with a tradition of tikkun olam, a community where it's not a coincidence that so many Jews throughout history have been on the forefront of peacemaking, of lifting people out of poverty, of doing all of the work that we need to do to make a better place. And it's not a coincidence that so many LGBTQ people are also on that same quest to make the world a better place, to lift people up, to make the world a place where everyone can be who they are and live a fulfilling life. So these communities have so much in common, and I'm so proud to be at that intersection, as I know so many of you are. And so with that, Shabbat Shalom, and again, thank you for having me.